The haunted rest stop on Route 84. Part 1. The Lure of the Forgotten. The road, for all its open spaces and endless horizon, can be the loneliest place on earth. After the third straight night of driving, your mind starts to play tricks on you. The white lines on the asphalt start to look like slithering snakes, and the shadows by the trees morph into strange, fleeting shapes. I'd been a professional driver for 17 years, and I'd always pushed to the next well-lit, populated truck stop. But that night was different. My body was begging for rest, and my mind was on the verge of giving up the fight. I felt the kind of exhaustion that makes you question if you're even awake anymore. I was on I-84, a stretch of highway notorious for its long, isolated miles between Texas and New Mexico. The night was thick and moonless, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow your headlights whole. A cold, damp air was clinging to the windshield, and a heavy mist was beginning to turn the world outside into a blurry, indistinct canvas of gray and black. My eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. I'd almost swerved off the road twice in the last hour, and I knew it was time to pull over, even if it was just for a few minutes. That's when I saw the sign, barely visible in the glare of my high beams. It was old and rusted, a single wooden post with a faded arrow pointing to a narrow, gravel path. Rest area 1 mile. It was a ghost of a sign, a remnant of a time before the big, shiny chains and fast food stops. Every bit of common sense I possessed screamed at me to keep going. That place looked like a trap. But the fatigue, it felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The thought of turning off the engine and just existing in silence, without the constant rumble, was more tempting than any comfort I had ever known. I slowed the rig down and took the turn. The tires crunched on loose gravel as I drove down the path. My headlights illuminated a scene of utter neglect. The asphalt of the parking lot was cracked and splintered, with weeds pushing through every fissure. A small, decrepit building stood at the far end of the lot, its windows boarded up with rotting wood. A sign, half pulled from its posts, creaked in a non-existent breeze. What was once a vibrant blue had faded to a sickly gray, and the words, "Welcome, drivers," were barely a memory. Near the building, a small playground sat in a state of absolute disrepair. A rusted slide stood next to a swing set that looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. The lot was not entirely empty. 3 other rigs were scattered around, their cabs dark. There was no sound, no light, no signs of life. They looked like massive, dormant beasts in the darkness. I pulled my truck to a stop and cut the engine. The world fell into a silence so profound it was physical. The only sound was the faint ticking of my engine as it cooled. It felt like I had driven into a vacuum. I opened the cab door and stepped out, stretching my arms above my head. The air was frigid and smelled of damp earth and decay. I shivered, but not just from the cold. A deep, unsettling feeling began to settle in my gut. That's when I heard it. A single, faint creak, like a rusty hinge. My eyes immediately went to the playground. One of the swings was swaying gently, back and forth. The others were perfectly still. My blood ran cold, and the rational part of my brain, the part that had been struggling to stay awake for hours, started to churn out explanations. Maybe a gust of wind had just passed. But there was no wind. The air was absolutely still. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like a lifetime. The swing continued its silent, unnatural rhythm. I took a hesitant step back towards my cab, and the swing came to a slow, deliberate halt. Just as suddenly as it had started, it was motionless again. My mind screamed at me to get back in the truck. This place was wrong. I fumbled with the keys, got back inside, and locked the door. I told myself it was just a coincidence. I pulled my curtain closed, slid into my bunk, and tried to force myself to relax. But every nerve in my body was on high alert. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. Waiting for something to break the unnatural calm of that deserted lot. Part 2. The Child's Invitation. I was just about to finally drift off when I heard it. A sound so soft, I thought for a moment it was a part of my dream. A child's giggle. It was high-pitched and filled with innocent delight, but it was also chillingly out of place. It seemed to come from right outside my window. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs like a fist. The giggling was followed by the unmistakable sound of small, running footsteps on the gravel, light and quick, as if a child was playing a game of tag. The footsteps stopped right next to the driver's side door of my rig. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the silence to return. But it didn't. Instead, a small, rhythmic tapping began. Tap, 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 tap. It was like a little kid, just tapping on the side of the truck with their fingers. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe a family was in one of the other trucks, and their kid had wandered out. But the other rigs were silent, dead. A whisper, so clear it sent a jolt of electricity down my spine, cut through the quiet. It was a sweet, sing-song voice. "Daddy, can you get me the doll?" I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I don't have a child. I was a single man on the road, with no one to call for a week at a time. My eyes were glued to the reflection in the window, watching for any movement outside. And that's when I saw it. The window was fogged over from the cold, but a small, ghostly outline of a hand and a face became visible as they pressed against the glass. The air around me felt suddenly colder, a wave of frigid air seeping into the warmth of my cab. The hands were small, tracing shapes on the glass. The tapping stopped, and for a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence. Then, a single word was scratched into the condensation. "Ride." The whisper came again, but this time, it was filled with a desperate, mournful pleading. It was a sob more than a request. I could hear it now, so close, so desperate, as if the spirit was right there beside me, its cold breath on the window. My body was screaming at me to move, to do something, but my mind was completely locked in place by terror. And then, the voice changed. The sweet, innocent tone vanished completely. It was replaced by a deep, guttural sound, like metal grinding against metal. A voice that was ancient and filled with an unspeakable hunger. The chilling sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. "I need a ride. Help me get back on the road!" It screamed, the sound muffled by the cab but still raw and terrifying. It was no longer a plea. It was a demand. A hunger. The doorknob on the driver's side began to rattle, a frantic, violent shake. I could hear something scraping against the door, a sound of metal on metal, and the glass of the window began to vibrate. It wasn't fingers anymore. It sounded like long, sharp nails clawing at the metal, digging into the frame, trying to force their way in. Panic took over. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grab them. I dropped them and had to scramble in the dark, my fingers searching the floor of the cab. I could hear the scraping intensify, the rattle of the door handle growing more and more desperate. The cold that had seeped into the cab grew stronger, a bone-deep chill that made my teeth chatter. I finally found the keys, my fingers closing around them like a lifeline. I jammed them into the ignition, and with a prayer on my lips, I turned the engine over. The motor roared to life, a beautiful, loud sound that felt like a shield against the darkness and the thing on the other side of my door. I slammed the gear into drive and hit the gas, the tires squealing on the pavement as I tore out of that lot. Part 3. A Ride to Nowhere. I didn't stop to look back, not for a single second. My heart was pounding, and my hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. Every inch of my being screamed at me to just drive, to get as far away from that place as possible. I sped down the gravel path, back toward the highway, the roar of my engine the only thing I could hear. The wind rushed past the cab, but it couldn't drown out the sound of the ghost scream in my memory. I swerved back onto the main highway, my rig shaking from the speed, and as I flew down the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. And for just a split second I saw her, standing in the middle of that empty, forgotten lot, waving at me. She wasn't little anymore. She was a tall, and possibly thin figure, with long, stringy hair blowing in a wind that wasn't there. Her eyes were two hollow, black pits, and her mouth was a gaping hole of silent screams. She was a silhouette of pure shadow and cold. She raised a skeletal hand, a hand that was nothing more than bone, and waved. But she didn't just wave. The figure began to move, impossibly fast. She started to glide down the highway, her dark shape keeping pace with my truck, her skeletal claws still waving, beckoning. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, my speedometer climbing higher and higher. 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. My rig rattled and groaned, protesting the speed, but I didn't care. I just needed to escape. I could still see her in my rearview, a dark, ghostly presence keeping up with me, her form wavering in the misty night. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look back again. But I could feel her presence, a cold pressure in the air, a phantom chill that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a ghost at a rest stop. It was a hunter on the road, and I was its prey. The chase continued for what felt like an eternity, but must have only been a few agonizing minutes. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished. The ghostly shape disappeared from my mirror, and the cold feeling in my cab subsided. I was alone again. I didn't stop until I hit a well-lit truck stop 100 miles down the road. I filled my mug with coffee and sat there for an hour, my hands still shaking, my mind replaying every horrifying detail. I later found out the story of that rest stop. A family disappeared from there decades ago. Their truck was found abandoned, but they were never seen again. Locals say the spirit of the little girl, the daughter, is still out there, waiting. But the stories they tell don't say she wants to go home alone. They say she wants company. And that night, she was hoping I'd be her co-driver for the rest of eternity. I never went back to that rest stop, and I never drove that stretch of I-84 again. Every time I see a rest stop sign at night, a cold chill runs down my spine. Because you never know what's waiting out there on the road, and you never know when it's your turn to get a call from a passenger looking for a ride. The one call I should never have answered. Part 1: The Ringing Phantom. The old landline phone in the cab had been a running joke for as long as I'd owned the rig. It was an antique, hardwired into the dashboard when the truck was built back in the 90s. A relic from a different time. The cord was frayed, the plastic was yellowed and cracked, and it had been dead for as long as I'd been driving it. It didn't have a number, it didn't have a signal, and it had never once made a sound. It was just a weird piece of nostalgia, a conversation starter for any curious passenger. I'd thought about ripping it out 100 times, but I never got around to it. It just sat there, a silent, useless companion on 1,000 lonely highways. Until that night. It was 2 a.m, somewhere in the middle of Montana, and the moon was a sliver of silver light peeking through the clouds. I was in a bad spot, a long stretch of highway with nothing but empty prairie for miles. I'd had a flat tire that took me 2 hours to fix, and the isolation was starting to get to me. The only sound was the low rumble of my engine and the quiet whisper of the wind against the windshield. I had my radio on low, a country station that was nothing but static and a faint guitar melody. And that's when it started. The old, dead phone in my cab began to ring. A low, insistent, old-fashioned ring. Not an electronic chirp, but a solid, mechanical bring-bring. I nearly put the rig into a ditch. My foot slammed on the brake pedal, and the truck skidded to a halt on the shoulder of the road. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the phone. It was impossible. It couldn't be ringing. I was miles from any town, any cell tower. The phone was a museum piece. And yet there it was. Ringing. It rang 3 times, paused, and then rang again. It felt like it was doing it for me, deliberately, a test of my sanity. My mind raced, searching for any logical explanation. An electrical short? A prank? But who would be out here, in the dead of night, to play a prank on me? There was no one. The only sign of life for miles was my own truck, parked on the side of a forgotten road. The ringing stopped. A profound silence fell over the cab, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I told myself it was just a hallucination, a side effect of the exhaustion and the fear. I should just ignore it. I should start the rig and get back on the road. But then, as I reached for the ignition, it rang again. This time it was louder, more persistent. It was a demanding, impatient sound. My hand was hovering over the key, but my eyes were locked on the phone. The absurdity of it was what finally pushed me to do it. The sheer impossibility of the situation was too great to ignore. Curiosity, that old, treacherous vice, got the better of me. Slowly, my hand reached out and picked up the receiver. It was cold to the touch, and it felt heavier than it should have. I put it to my ear, bracing myself for silence or static. Instead, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. It wasn't static. It was something else. A low, wet, gurgling sound, like a deep-throated choke. It was a sound of agony and distress, and it filled the receiver with a sickening clarity. I wanted to drop the phone, to throw it across the cab, but my hand felt like it was glued to the receiver. And then, a whisper cut through the gurgling. It was a woman's voice, but it was thin and raspy, as if she were speaking through a broken throat. She was barely audible over the gruesome sound, but I could make out her words. Don't go to the next town," she whispered. "Don't go to the cafe." The words were broken up by more of that wet, awful gurgling. I wanted to ask her who she was, where she was, but I couldn't form the words. My tongue felt like a block of ice in my mouth. My mind was screaming. What was happening? And then the voice changed, the gurgling sound getting louder and more frantic. The words were a frantic warning, a desperate plea. He's waiting for you. He knows you're coming." The line went dead. The gurgling stopped, replaced by a soft, humming static. I dropped the receiver onto the cradle with a clatter. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat there in the darkness, the phone now silent again, the gurgling sound still echoing in my ears. I had just gotten a call from, what? A ghost? A dying woman? A demon? And what was it trying to warn me about? The next town. The cafe. What was there? I had a delivery to make, and the fastest route was straight through that town. But after what I just heard, I wasn't sure I could go on. Part 2. The Whispered Warning. The silence after the call was a new kind of terror. The phone was dead again, its receiver lying in its cradle like a harmless piece of plastic. But I knew better. The wet, gurgling sound and the broken whisper were still ringing in my ears. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I tried to calm myself down. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the mind. Maybe I just dreamed it all. But the cold dread that had settled in my stomach was as real as the steering wheel under my hands. I picked up my phone, my old flip phone that barely got a signal out here, and tried to Google the next town. All I got was an old, out-of-date page from a local chamber of commerce. It mentioned a diner on the outskirts of town, a place called the Crossroads Cafe. No mention of any tragedy. No mention of anything out of the ordinary. Just an old, faded picture of a brick building with a neon sign. But the voice on the phone had been specific. Don't go to the cafe. My gut was screaming at me to listen to the warning. Just turn around. Take the long way. But the dispatcher was expecting me. My delivery was time-sensitive. A detour would cost me an entire day, and I would miss my deadline. Every logical fiber of my being told me to ignore the ghostly call and just push through. But every illogical, terrified part of me was telling me to listen. The voice had known where I was. It had known my route. How could it have known that? A cold, rational fear began to creep in. This wasn't just a random message. It was personal. It was a warning meant specifically for me. I gripped the steering wheel and took a deep breath. I had to know. I had to see. I had to find out what was at that cafe. Was it just a harmless diner, and I was just being paranoid? Or was it something more? I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the road. The moon had gone behind a cloud, and the night was even darker now. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I drove, I kept glancing at the old phone, half expecting it to ring again. But it was silent. The only sound was the low drone of my engine. I was halfway to the town when a low, almost inaudible whisper began to fill the cab. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from everywhere. It was a faint sound, like a dry leaf skittering across the floor. "Turn back," it hissed. "Turn back." I sped up, trying to drown out the sound with the engine. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It started to sound like multiple voices, whispering in unison, a chorus of dry, rustling sounds. He knows you're coming, he's waiting." I put my hands over my ears, but the whispers were in my head now. They were inside my skull. I was losing my mind. I was going crazy. I wasn't even 10 miles from the town when the whispers stopped. A dead, suffocating silence took their place. I looked ahead, and I saw a glow on the horizon. The lights of the town. My stomach tightened into a knot. I wanted to stop, to turn around. But I had to know. I had to see. The trucker in me, the part that was stubborn and refused to back down from a challenge, took over. I pushed on. I drove through the empty streets of the town. All the buildings were dark, their windows like black eyes. It was a ghost town, even though it was on a major highway. I saw the neon sign for the Crossroads Cafe glowing faintly at the edge of the town. It was the only light for miles. As I approached, a profound sense of dread washed over me. The cafe looked just like the picture on the website, a small, unremarkable brick building. But something was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. I saw the neon sign. But the letters, they were flickering, and as I drove past, they rearranged themselves. They twisted and turned, forming new words in the glow of the flickering light. "You're next," the sign read. I slammed on the brakes, my rig screeching to a halt just past the building. I stared at the sign, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. The letters flickered again and went back to their original words, the Crossroads Cafe. I was going insane. This wasn't real. None of this was real. But then a sudden, jarring sound came from inside my cab. The phone. The dead phone. It rang again. My hand shook as I reached for it. I knew I shouldn't answer. But I had to. I had to know. I had to know who was on the other end. Part 3. The Price of Disobedience. My hand, as if acting on its own, picked up the receiver of the dead phone. It was heavier this time, and colder. It felt wrong, like a piece of bone. I brought it to my ear, my heart pounding in my chest. The gurgling sound was gone. In its place was a whisper. But it wasn't the woman's whisper. It was a man's voice. A deep, raspy, malicious whisper that sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated terror through my soul. He was right there. He was speaking right into my ear. "You didn't listen," he hissed. "You came anyway." The whisper was full of triumph and dark amusement. It was the voice of a predator who had finally caught its prey. My mind went blank. All I could feel was pure, gut-wrenching dread. "You should have stayed on the road," the voice whispered. "You should have listened to the first warning. Now, you get to see." The man's whisper turned into a low, terrifying laugh. A laugh that had no humor, only malice. A cold, palpable dread filled the cab, so thick I could feel it on my skin. The lights in the truck flickered. The radio turned on, blasting white noise at full volume. The doors automatically locked, then unlocked, over and over again. The windows rolled down, a frigid blast of wind and rain rushing into the cab. I screamed, fumbling for the receiver to hang up, to drop the bone-like piece of plastic. But I couldn't. My hand was stuck. The phone was a part of me now. And the man's voice whispered again, closer this time, as if he were sitting in the passenger seat beside me. "Look," he hissed. "Look at the window." My eyes were frozen, staring out at the cafe. Through the flickering light of the neon sign, I could see them. inside the windows. They were shadowy figures, their bodies thin and spectral. I could see them moving inside the cafe, sitting at the tables, standing by the counter. They were just blurry shapes at first, but then they began to take form. A woman was sitting at a booth, her head tilted to the side at a grotesque angle. A man stood by the counter, his chest covered in a dark, wet stain. They were all there. The people from the faded photos on the wall. They were all dead. And then they turned to look at me. Their faces were hollowed out, their eyes two empty black pits of despair and hatred. And they began to bang on the windows. Not a physical banging, but a sound that was a mix of a ghostly shriek and a desperate plea, a sound that rattled in my mind, not in the air. "You brought him to us!" A spectral voice shrieked, seeming to come from the man with the stained chest. "You brought him back!" The whispers and the shouts filled my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it all out, but it was useless. It was inside my head. And then I heard the man's whisper again, a low, triumphant hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "They're not angry at me," he hissed. "They're angry at you. You brought me here. You should have just kept driving. But you just couldn't resist." The cab suddenly went silent. The static stopped. The lights went back to normal. The whispers were gone. I was alone again. I opened my eyes and looked at the cafe. The windows were empty. The sign was normal. The Crossroads Cafe. Again. But I could still feel the cold. I could still hear the whispers. I fumbled with the keys and started the rig. I drove off, speeding down the road, not daring to look back. I drove until the sun came up and the air felt clean again. I never went back to that town. I later found an old newspaper article about a mass shooting at a diner called the Crossroads Cafe. The owner, a man who had gone insane from a business failure, had killed everyone inside, including himself. The article said the landline phone in the diner had been inexplicably ringing a week before the massacre, even though the phone lines had been cut. I threw the old phone out of my cab and watched it shatter on the highway. But the call never truly ended. I still hear the whispers on the quiet, lonely stretches of road. The whispers that tell me to turn back, that tell me he's waiting, that tell me I should have just kept driving. And I know, deep down, that the call didn't come from a ghost, but from a hunter. And all I did was give him a ride. The Fog on the Appalachian Trail. Part 1. The Descent into the Fog. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful, no doubt about it. All that green, the rolling hills, the tiny little towns nestled in the valleys. But driving a big rig through them is a whole different kind of experience. The roads are narrow, winding, and unforgiving. They're built for cars, not for a 50-foot rig trying to navigate blind turns and steep grades. Every turn is a tight squeeze, every climb a struggle. You're isolated up there, with miles between you and the next sign of life, just you and the mountain. I'd been hauling freight through those mountains for a decade, and I thought I knew every trick, every curve, every dip in the road. But what I learned one night is that there's a part of those mountains that doesn't care about experience or skill. A part that's older than the road, older than the trees, and it's just waiting for you to get lost in it. It was just after midnight. I was on a back road, trying to cut time off my route to hit my delivery window. The air was heavy, damp, and still. The night was pitch black, with no moon, just the stars above that you could only glimpse through the gaps in the tall trees. That's when the fog rolled in. Now, I've driven through mountain fog before. It's usually a wet, chilly haze that sits low in the valleys. But this was different. This wasn't a haze. It was a solid, living thing. It was like a wall of thick, white smoke that just swallowed everything. The world outside my windshield went from a dark, recognizable road to a pure, opaque white. I couldn't see the road lines, couldn't see the trees, couldn't even see the hood of my own truck. The fog was so thick it felt like I was driving through a bucket of milk. It had a strange, sweet, almost metallic smell to it, like old rust and rain. I slowed the rig down to a crawl, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see a thing. The GPS on my dash, which had been working perfectly just moments before, went haywire. The little blue dot that represented my truck started spinning in frantic circles, the map behind it turning into a jumbled mess of red and green lines. I tried to hail anyone on the CB radio, but all I got was a wall of dead static. No other drivers, no chatter, just the sound of 1,000 angry hornets buzzing in the speaker. It was a suffocating silence, broken only by the drone of my engine and the whisper of the tires on the asphalt. The fog didn't just obscure sight, it swallowed sound. The whole world went quiet, as if I were in a glass box. I was feeling a cold dread set in, a primal fear of being utterly, completely lost. I couldn't see anything, and the sound of my own truck seemed to be getting fainter. I decided to pull over. I wasn't going to risk running off a cliff in this stuff. I found a small shoulder on the side of the road and slowly eased the truck to a stop. I cut the engine, and the silence was absolute. It was so quiet it hurt my ears. And then I heard it. A faint, distant sound coming from the woods that lined the road. A sound like a low, hollow thud, almost like a drumbeat. It was impossibly far away, but at the same time, impossibly clear. It had a rhythm to it, a slow, deliberate pattern. Thump, 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 thump. It was the only thing I could hear, and it seemed to be getting closer. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I pulled my curtain closed, plunging the cab into total darkness. My hands were shaking. I had a feeling that the silence wasn't a sign of peace. It was a sign that something was listening. And that drumbeat, it wasn't a drum. It was something else. And it was coming for me. Part 2, The Whispering Woods. The sound of the rhythmic thumping stopped as abruptly as it began. A profound and utter silence returned, so complete it made the air feel thick and heavy. I was alone in the cab, surrounded by the impenetrable white of the fog. I had my hands wrapped around a can of mace, my only real defense. I was a big man, but I was suddenly feeling very small, very vulnerable. That's when I heard the whispers. Not a voice, not a person, but whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves on the ground. They were coming from all around me, from the woods, from the air, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sound was indistinct, a mix of 100 different whispers, like a crowd of people talking to each other at a great distance, their voices a low, unintelligible hum. But then, as they got closer, I could make out words. And they were speaking my name. Frank. Frank, you're lost. The whispers hissed. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, to convince myself that I was just hearing things. But it was too clear. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't just a crowd of voices now, they were distinct, individual whispers. One sounded like a small child's voice. Another was a deep, gravelly rasp. A third was a woman's voice, cold and empty. They were all saying different things, but they all had the same message. I wasn't welcome here. I was a trespasser. The fog wants you, a high, reedy whisper said. Don't look at the fog, another one said, right by my window. I couldn't help it. My eyes shot open and I peered out my side window, trying to see something through the dense white. And that's when I saw it. A glimpse of something in the fog. A pale, slender figure with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. It was moving quickly and silently through the trees, a ghost-like blur. It wasn't human. Not at all. My heart was racing, my mind screaming. This wasn't a hallucination. There was something in the woods, something that belonged to the fog, and it was watching me. The whispers grew more agitated, a cacophony of hissing and muttering. I could hear a new sound now, a rhythmic, dragging sound, like something was pulling itself through the undergrowth. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was getting closer to the truck, and I could feel it. I could feel a cold, heavy presence just outside my cab, pressing in. The shadows inside my cab, cast by the faint glow of my dashboard, seemed to stretch and writhe. I glanced in my side mirror, and through the thick fog I saw it again. the pale figure. But this time it wasn't moving. It was standing still, staring right at my truck. I couldn't see its face, just a pale, featureless orb. It was a sentinel. And the whispers were now a chorus of malevolent glee. They knew I was terrified. They were enjoying it. A new whisper cut through the others. It was a clear, calm, and utterly terrifying voice. It sounded like an old man, and it was speaking right outside my door. It was so close I could almost feel its breath. "You are our new guest," the voice said, its words clear and distinct. "The fog has been waiting. It has been hungry." The sound of the scraping, dragging thing grew louder, closer. I could hear it just outside my cab now, right at the back of the truck. And then I felt it. The truck rocked slightly, as if something was climbing onto the flatbed. I was trapped. I was lost. I was surrounded by a chorus of whispers and the knowledge that something was standing on my rig, a creature of the fog that was hungry and had finally found a meal. Part 3: Escape from the Trail. The truck groaned under the weight. The whispers were now a chaotic symphony of glee, and the voice of the old man was a triumphant laugh, cold and merciless. I could hear it scrambling on top of my truck, and I felt a new wave of terror. I had to get out of there. I had to leave now. I fumbled for the keys, jammed them into the ignition, and twisted. Nothing. Just the soft click of the starter. The engine was dead. I tried again and again, but the truck wouldn't start. It was as if something was holding it in place. The whispers now turned into a torrent of mockery. "You won't leave," a child's voice hissed from my window. "You're ours now." My heart was in my throat, and I felt tears of pure fear stinging my eyes. The sound of the scraping thing on my roof was getting louder, closer to my cab. A pale, skeletal hand appeared at the corner of my side window. It was long and thin, with gnarled fingers that were too long to be human. It pressed against the glass, leaving a trail of condensation on the inside of my cab. It was impossibly cold. The voice of the old man was right beside my ear, so close now that it sounded like it was coming from inside my head. "The fog needs a new driver," the voice whispered. "It needs a new passenger. We've been waiting so long. Just open the door. We'll make it quick." The skeletal hand began to tap on the window, a rhythmic, horrifying pattern. Tap, tap, tap. A chilling, dry chuckle came from all around me. I was trapped. I was going to die here, in the cold, wet, silent fog of the Appalachian Trail. I closed my eyes, squeezed the steering wheel, and prepared to meet my end. But then, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the fog. A sound that was a low, distant drone, like a heavy engine. My eyes shot open. It was the sound of another truck, a diesel engine cutting through the dead silence. It was a lifeline. I jammed the key in the ignition one last time, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life. The sudden burst of noise was like a shockwave. The sound of the scraping on my roof stopped. The tapping on my window stopped. The whispers vanished. I slammed the truck into drive and peeled out of the spot, speeding back down the road, leaving the fog and the things within it behind me. As I drove, I could see them in my rearview mirror, a chorus of pale, gaunt figures standing in the fog, staring after me. They were a part of the fog, and they were trying to take me. I didn't stop until I broke through the fog, into the clear, starry night. The first thing I saw was a well-lit truck stop, a beacon of safety and warmth. I pulled in and sat there for hours, shaking, trying to piece together what had happened. I never drove that stretch of the Appalachian Trail again. I later learned of a local legend about the trail walkers, pale, gaunt figures that appear in a strange, thick fog. They are said to be the spirits of drivers who got lost in the fog and were never heard from again. The fog is their domain, and they pull other drivers in to take their place. I was lucky. Another trucker, a real one, came along and his engine sound was enough to break their hold on me, just for a moment. But I know that wasn't the end of it. On cold, rainy nights, I can still hear the whispers in my mind. Frank, you're lost," the voices hiss. And I know that somewhere in the fog of the Appalachian Trail, The whispers are still waiting for me to take my final ride. He knew my route before I did. Part 1. The Stranger on the CB. The loneliest sound in the world isn't a scream. It's silence. And on a long haul through the American Southwest, you get more than enough of it. Just the constant drone of the engine, the hiss of the tires on the asphalt, and the vast, empty expanse of the desert stretching out in every direction. The only real company I had was my CB radio, a lifeline to other drivers and a constant stream of chatter about weather, road conditions, and gossip. For most of the trip, it was the only thing that kept me sane. It was a normal day, a normal route, nothing special about it at all. I was on a stretch of highway in New Mexico, heading towards Arizona, with nothing to see but dust and tumbleweeds. I was in my own little world, just me and the road. That's when a new voice came over the CB. It wasn't the usual trucker voice, a gruff drawl or a tired shout. It was calm, clear, almost unnervingly so. It had a smooth, articulate tone, like a radio host. 10-4, to the southbound rig. Looks like you've got a loose latch on that trailer door. Better pull over and check it out before you lose some cargo. I was a few hundred miles from civilization, and this guy was talking to me like he was right beside me. I glanced in my mirror. I had just passed a small town, but there was no one behind me. I checked my rig. The door on the trailer was latched, but it was just a little loose. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice until it was too late. I pulled over, tightened the latch, and got back in the cab. I grabbed the mic. "Hey, thanks for the heads up. How did you know that?" I asked, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and unease. The voice came back, just as calm as before. "The road told me, my friend. The road tells me everything. You can call me the Traveler." Over the next 2 hours, the Traveler's voice was the only thing on the radio. He didn't just give me warnings about road conditions. He started telling me about things that were impossible for him to know. "Looks like you're low on fuel, friend. There's a pump a few miles up that still works, even though it's been abandoned for years. Don't worry about paying, it's all on me." I pulled into the old, rusted gas station, and sure enough, one of the pumps sputtered to life. I filled my tank, and the total on the screen was 0. I tried to hail him on the CB, but there was no answer. He knew where I was, what my fuel gauge read, and he knew my rig was low on fuel. He knew my name, too. "Hey, Mark. Looks like your wife is waiting for you in Denver. You're going to be late. But don't worry, the road has its own time." My wife hadn't even told me she was going to Denver. I hadn't talked to her for days. My blood ran cold. How could he know that? The voice was no longer a friendly presence. It was a terrifying, all-knowing force that seemed to be everywhere. I tried to ask him how he knew so much, but he just laughed, a low, unsettling chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. I was getting seriously spooked. I had a shortcut in my head, a back road I could take to cut 2 hours off my trip. It was a route that only a handful of truckers knew, a secret to avoid traffic. I hadn't told anyone about it. I was just thinking about it when his voice came back on the radio. "Don't take the shortcut, Mark. The road is angry tonight. Take the long way. It's safer." My hand was on the switch to turn off the CB, but I just froze. How did he know? How could he know what I was thinking? This wasn't a trucker. This wasn't a person. This was something else. A stalker. A ghost. A demon. Whatever he was in my head, in my truck, on my route. My privacy was gone. My sanity was hanging by a thread. I reached over and, with a trembling hand, flicked the CB switch to the off position. The silence was deafening, but it was a welcome sound. I had to get away from him. I had to get away from the road that seemed to have a mind of its own. The silence after I turned off the CB was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I drove for a full hour, my heart still pounding in my chest, but the terror was slowly being replaced by a sense of relief. It was over. I had cut the cord. The traveler was gone. I was alone again, just me and my rig and the open road. I started to convince myself that it had all been a joke, a complicated prank pulled by a couple of truckers with some sophisticated equipment. The fuel thing was probably a trick of the light, the wife in Denver a lucky guess. I was just tired, I told myself. I was just seeing things. I finally felt safe. That's when I heard a new voice over the CB. It was a different voice, a young, frantic voice, crackling with static. "Hey, anybody hear me? This is Trucker 275. I got a crazy guy on my radio. He keeps talking about some rig ahead of him. Says his name is the Traveler. He's talking about someone named Mark. You hear me, Mark? He says he's right behind you. He's getting closer." My blood ran cold. I hadn't turned on my radio. It was still off. I looked at the switch on my CB, and sure enough, it was in the off position. How was I hearing this? The frantic voice was clearly from a different rig. The signal was weak, but I could hear it. I stared into my rearview mirror, but all I could see was the empty road behind me. No lights. No other trucks. Just the desolate highway stretching to the horizon. "He says he knows where you're going." The voice came again, more frantic this time. "He says you're turning off onto the shortcut. He says you shouldn't have turned off the CB." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. This wasn't a prank. This was a direct, terrifying message. The voice was a medium, a conduit for the Traveler to send me a message, to let me know he was still there. And he knew about the shortcut. The shortcut that I had decided against taking. The one I hadn't told anyone about. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to look into the rearview mirror. And that's when I saw them. A pair of headlights. They were impossibly far away, just two pinpricks of light in the distance. But they were moving impossibly fast. They were a flash of light, a flicker, and then they were gone. But in that brief moment, I felt a chilling sense of presence. I put the pedal to the metal. I had to get away. I had to outrun him. But the road was straight and empty, and there was nowhere to go. The voice of the Traveler returned to the CB, but it was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from everywhere. It was a low, chilling whisper in my head, a voice that was both inside and outside the cab. "You can't outrun me, Mark," the voice whispered. "I'm already here. I've always been here. The road is my home. You are my guest. You're just the driver." My heart was in my throat. This wasn't a CB conversation. This was a mental intrusion. He was inside my head. And he knew my deepest fears. The voice was now a low, triumphant hiss. "You want to know how I knew your route before you did? You want to know how I knew your name? It's simple, Mark. I'm the road. I'm the voice in the wind, the shadow in the corner, the sound of the tires. And I've been riding shotgun with you since you left the last truck stop. I knew your route because I was on it with you. You're just carrying me." The voice chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. I was not alone. He was with me. He had always been with me. And he was riding in my truck. The chilling whisper of the Traveler filled my mind. "I've been in this rig for years, Mark. I've been with every driver. They come and go, but I stay. The road is endless, but I'm tired of walking. I need a new driver. A new body. A new host." The voice was a cold, malicious presence, a parasite that had found its way into my mind. I was going to lose my sanity. I was going to lose my mind. I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw a shape. It was in the passenger seat, a faint, shadowy figure. It was a blurred outline of a man, thin and gaunt, his eyes two hollow, black pits. It was the Traveler. He was right there. He was my passenger. "Don't worry, Mark," the voice whispered in my head. "It won't hurt. It's just a transition. A beautiful, peaceful transition. Just give me the wheel. We can go together. Forever." I felt a cold, phantom hand on my arm. My body wasn't my own anymore. My foot was pressing down on the gas pedal, and my hands were turning the wheel, but I wasn't the one doing it. I was just a passenger in my own body, a witness to my own demise. The truck was accelerating, going faster and faster, heading towards a sheer cliff face in the distance. I could feel the presence of the traveler, his icy touch on my skin, his cold breath on my neck. I was losing the battle. He was taking over. In a last, desperate attempt, I fought back. I focused on my wife's name. I focused on her face. I focused on my home, on the life I was supposed to get back to. I screamed in my mind, a silent, powerful scream. I pushed back against the cold, invasive presence in my head. I bit my tongue, the taste of blood a jolt of reality. I wasn't just a host. I was a man. And I wasn't going to die out here, in the middle of nowhere, with a ghost in my truck. I'm not a traveler! I screamed in my mind. I'm a driver! And this is my truck! For a moment, his presence receded. The cold grip on my arm loosened. I slammed my foot on the brake pedal, and with a screech of tires and a blast of smoke, my rig slid to a halt just inches from the edge of the cliff. The voice in my head was gone. The chilling presence in the passenger seat was gone. The road ahead was just a normal, empty stretch of highway. I was alone again. I got out of the truck, my body shaking uncontrollably. I walked to the edge of the cliff and looked down, my legs nearly giving out. I had to get away. I had to get away from the road that had tried to kill me. I never drove that route again. I sold my rig and took a job working for a local delivery company. I now only drive in the city, where there are streetlights and people and noise. But on cold, quiet nights, when I'm walking home, I can still feel it. I can still feel a cold breeze on the back of my neck. I can still hear a faint whisper in my head. Just a driver. It hisses. But I'll be waiting. I'll always be waiting. The road is not just asphalt and gravel. It's a living, breathing, and terrifying thing. And the traveler is a part of it. He's still out there, riding shotgun in another rig, in another mind. He's looking for a new driver. And I know, deep down, that he's just waiting for the next lonely trucker to make a wrong turn, and to receive a call that he should never have answered. My last delivery to the Mojave. Part 1: The Whispering Dust. The Mojave Desert is a place of endless, breathtaking beauty. It's a silent, vast ocean of sand and rock under a sun so hot it seems to hum. After 40 years behind the wheel of a rig, I'd seen it all. The bustling cities, the snow-covered mountains, the endless green of the Midwest. But the desert was a different kind of beast. It's a place that teaches you about silence. My last delivery was to the Mojave. I was retiring. One final trip, one final drop-off, and I was going home for good. The cargo was strange. A single, heavy wooden crate, no markings, no labels, just a set of coordinates on a flimsy piece of paper. The name of the client was listed as the Homestead. My dispatcher, a young kid who was new to the job, just shrugged. The client said the directions are on the manifest. Just drop it and get paid. He had no idea how I'd been driving through the desert for years, making a living on the back roads and forgotten routes, and I still didn't know how to prepare for this. The coordinates were in the middle of nowhere, miles off the main highway, down a series of dirt roads that weren't on any map. My GPS, a brand new model that had never failed me, started to glitch out. The little blue arrow on the screen would jump and spin, and the voice would repeat, recalculating route, over and over again, as if it was lost, as if it didn't know where it was. The air was dead still, heavy with the heat and the smell of dry earth. But I could hear something. A faint, low whispering. It was like the sound of 1,000 people muttering at once, just on the edge of my hearing. I pulled over, cut the engine, and opened the door. Nothing. The only sound was the heat shimmer rising from the hood of my truck. The whispering was gone. I told myself it was just the heat, a mirage in the silence. I kept driving, The road getting rougher and rougher, the dust billowing up behind me in a thick, choking cloud. The whispering returned. This time it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise, it was words. "Go back," a faint, dry voice hissed. "He's waiting, he knows." My blood ran cold. The whispers were coming from the dust itself. I saw the dust devils swirling in the distance, but these were different. They were thin and tall, and they seemed to be moving with a purpose. They were swirling around, forming into strange, human-like shapes, like gaunt, desiccated figures made of dust and wind. They were moving alongside my rig, keeping pace with me. They were watching me. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to push in on me from all sides. I was no longer alone in the desert. I was being escorted. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to keep going. I was so close. The coordinates were just ahead. The GPS, which had been silent for an hour, suddenly beeped. "You have arrived at your destination." I looked up, and through the swirling dust I saw it. A single, dilapidated homestead. A small, weathered house, a collapsing barn, and a rusted mailbox. It was a ghost town, an outpost of nothingness. But it was my destination. The dust figures that had been following me now stood still, a silent, menacing crowd of human-like forms, watching me. They were waiting. They were waiting for me to make my delivery. And I had a feeling that this delivery wasn't just my last. It was my final. Part 2: The Silent Homestead. The homestead was even more desolate up close. The house was just a ruin, its windows broken and its door hanging loose on a single hinge. The barn, a collapsing structure of rotted wood, looked like it was about to fall over. I pulled my rig to a stop in front of the barn, and the dust figures that had been following me stopped too, silently gathering around my truck. They were still there, like ghostly sentinels, watching my every move. I cut the engine, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft creak of the barn door in the dry wind. A single, bare light bulb was hanging from the rafters of the barn, casting a faint, sickly yellow light on the dusty floor. It was a beacon in the darkness, a lure. My manifest said to leave the cargo in the barn, and my instructions were clear. So I did. I opened the back of my rig and lowered the lift gate, the heavy wooden crate resting on the steel platform. As I began to maneuver the crate towards the barn, the whispering returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't a cry of warning. It was a chorus of dry, crackling voices, like 1,000 pieces of sandpaper rubbing against each other. "Leave it, leave it, leave it here," they hissed. The dust figures moved closer, surrounding me, their forms more distinct now. I could see the outlines of their bodies, tall and thin, with long, desiccated limbs. They looked like mummified corpses, animated by the desert wind and the dust itself. They weren't solid, but I could feel them, a cold pressure in the air, a sense of patient malice. Their arms were raised, their long, skeletal fingers pointing to the wooden crate. They wanted it. They wanted me to give it to them. I knew, with a sudden, horrifying certainty, what the cargo was. It wasn't a product. It wasn't an item. It was a person. It was a soul. The wooden crate was a vessel, a container for something they were waiting for. My blood ran cold as I looked at the crate, a simple wooden box with nothing on it. I looked at the dust figures. They were not angry. They were not threatening. They were pleading. They were begging. "Open the box," one of the voices hissed, clearer this time. Let him go, and you can leave." My mind raced. Was this a test? Were they going to take the person inside the box and let me go? Or was this a trap? Was I going to open the box and become one of them? Another soul trapped in the Mojave, forever a part of the dust and the wind. The dust figures moved closer, their whispers turning into a low, mournful wail. They were crying. Crying for a release. Crying for a freedom they couldn't have. And they were waiting for me to give it to them. I felt a sudden, cold touch on my back. A gaunt, dusty finger tapped my shoulder, and I flinched. The dust figure behind me pointed to the box, its head tilted to the side as if in a silent question. My hand was on the handle of the crate. I could feel the presence inside. It was cold. It was still. It was a person, a soul, a ghost trapped in a wooden box. And I was supposed to release it. I was supposed to open the box, to let the spirit inside go. And I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that if I opened that box, I would become the next occupant. My heart was in my throat. I couldn't do it. I couldn't trade my life for a ghost. I couldn't become a part of the dust. I had to get out of there. My hands were shaking, and I looked at the crowd of dust figures, their silent, empty faces staring at me, waiting. They had me. I had to decide. My last delivery was also my final choice. Part 3: The Price of the Cargo. I took my hand off the crate. I was not going to open the box. I was not going to give them what they wanted. I was going to get out of there. I turned and ran back to my rig, the sound of the dust figures wailing turning into a silent, enraged scream. I could feel their fury, a cold, malevolent force pushing at me. They were no longer silent. They were angry. I jumped into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I jammed the key in the ignition. The engine turned over, groaned, and then died. The truck was dead. A cold, suffocating silence filled the cab, and I looked out the window. The dust figures had surrounded the rig, their forms more distinct now, their faces gaunt and skeletal. They were pressing their hands against the windows, a silent chorus of enraged souls. A clear, dry voice, a whisper from the dust itself, came from the passenger seat. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You're our last hope. Just open the box. Release him. And you can go." The whispers were a temptation, a promise of freedom. But I knew better. The box wasn't just a prison for a soul, it was a curse. I was the one who was supposed to deliver it, to become a part of the homestead. I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was the new delivery boy, the new resident of the Mojave. A gaunt, skeletal face pressed against my window, its mouth a black, empty hole. It was screaming, a soundless, terrifying cry that seemed to rip a hole in the air. The dust figures were growing more frantic, their hands banging on the sides of my rig, a soft, drumming sound of pure rage. They were going to kill me. They were going to take me. In a last, desperate act, I reached for the ignition again. I closed my eyes and screamed in my mind, a silent, powerful scream. I focused on my home, on the life I was going to have. And I turned the key. The engine roared to life with a cough and a sputter, a defiant sound that broke the silence of the homestead. The dust figures backed away, their silent screams echoing in my mind. I slammed the truck into drive and peeled out of there, leaving the homestead and the screaming spirits behind. I sped down the dirt road, the dust cloud behind me a swirl of angry ghosts. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I drove until the sun came up, until the desert was just a vast, beautiful ocean of sand and rock. I was a free man. I had escaped. I never made it to retirement. I drove to the nearest town, and I took the wooden crate and threw it in the town's landfill, hoping to bury the curse. But the curse was not in the crate. It was in the cargo. It was in the fact that I had refused to deliver it. I never stopped hearing the whispers. On cold, quiet nights, the wind still whispers to me. I can still see the dust devils, and I know they are not just dust. They are the souls of the lost, and they are waiting for me to join them. I am still driving. The cargo is with me, a ghost in my cab. I never made my last delivery to the Mojave. And I know, deep down, that I'll be driving forever, with a silent passenger and a chorus of whispers that follow me wherever I go.